They called it a pauper's auction, but it was a soul market. In the dusty heart of Redemption Gulch, a town that had forgotten the meaning of its own name, a woman and her children were put on the block. Lillian Thompson, a widow with eyes as haunted as a winter graveyard, stood beaten but unbroken. Beside her, her twin children, Caleb and Sarah, clung to her worn dress. Then a stranger stepped from the shadows, a lone cowboy named Silas Blackwood. A man with a past as scarred as his face made a bid that silenced the jeering crowd. He didn't just buy their debt, he bought them. And what he did next wasn't just an act of charity. It was an act of reckoning that would unravel a dark secret and shatter a town built on lies. The sun over Redemption Gulch in the summer of 1888 was a merciless molten coin in a bleached blue scum. It baked the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, on the sweat-slicked hats of tired men, the drooping bonnets of weary women, and the silent, weathered facades of the buildings that lined the thoroughfare. It was a town gasping for breath, both from the heat and from the casual cruelty that had become its lifeblood. Today, that cruelty had a stage. In the center of the town square, next to the gallows that cast a long skeletal shadow in the afternoon light, stood a makeshift wooden platform. This was the site of the pauper's auction, a vile tradition where the debts of the unfortunate were sold off to the highest bidder. The price included not just their meager possessions, but a period of indentured servitude. It was slavery by another name, a spectacle for the bored and a bargain for the ruthless. And on that block, under the relentless glare of the sun and the even more relentless stares of the townsfolk, stood Lillian Thompson and her 6-year-old twins, Caleb and Sarah. Lillian was a ghost of a woman. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was now a tattered patchwork of faded blues and grays, clinging to a frame made frail by grief and starvation. A fresh, ugly bruise purpled her left cheekbone, a stark contrast to the pale, translucent quality of her skin. It was a parting gift from her late husband's brother Cyrus, the man who had seized their small, failing farm and cast her and her children into the abyss of poverty. Her eyes, however, held a flicker of defiance. They were the color of a stormy sea, and though rimmed with the red of exhaustion and unshed tears, they met the leering gazes of the crowd with a silent, steely resolve. Caleb and Sarah were her anchors in this swirling vortex of humiliation. The twins were mirror images of each other, with their mother's dark, curly hair and wide, frightened eyes. Caleb, his small jaw set in a miniature version of his mother's, defiance stood protectively in front of her, one small hand clutching the frayed fabric of her skirt. Sarah, smaller and more fragile, hid behind her mother, her face buried in the folds, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The auctioneer, a portly, sweat-sheened man named Bartholomew Barty Higgins, reveled in the sordid theater of it all. He was the town's undertaker and its self-appointed master of ceremonies for misery. "All right, folks, settle down, settle down." Barty's voice boomed slick with false bonhomie. "A tragic case we have today." The widow Thompson left destitute by the untimely passing of her husband. God rest his soul, and the subsequent unfortunate but necessary foreclosure by her good brother-in-law, Mr. Cyrus Thompson. He gestured toward Cyrus, who stood preening near the front of the crowd, a man whose piety was as thin as his smile. "The debt stands at $150. Barty announced, his eyes scanning the crowd for bidders. A hefty sum. But for that price you get not just the satisfaction of a Christian duty fulfilled, but the service of this fine, sturdy woman for a period of 2 years. And look here, he added, reaching out to roughly grab Caleb's shoulder, pulling him forward. The boy flinched, but didn't cry out. You get 2 for the price of 1. A boy to run errands, and a girl. Well, a girl to help the missus with the mending, eh? A wave of coarse laughter rippled through the assembled men. Their wives, for the most part, looked on with a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. Lillian's fall was a cautionary tale they could whisper about over their sewing circles, a reminder of their own precarious positions. Do I hear $20 to start? Barty bellowed. $20 for 2 years of labor and a clear conscience. The bidding was sluggish and laced with contempt. 25 yelled a grimy-faced blacksmith, his eyes lingering on Lillian's form in a way that made her skin crawl. 30 countered a saloon owner, his gaze just as foul. Cyrus Thompson watched smug and secure. This was his design. He had driven them to this point, counting on the town's avarice to swallow them whole. He had no interest in bidding himself. He just wanted to see Lillian utterly broken, to erase this last vestige of his brother's life from the town. He wanted her gone and her children with her, their potential claim to the land extinguished forever. The price crept up in insulting increments. $40. 45. Each bid was a fresh lash of humiliation. Lillian felt her spirit begin to fray. She could endure this for herself, but the thought of her children being subjected to the whims of one of these callous men was a horror beyond imagining. She squeezed Caleb's hand, her knuckles white. $50, the blacksmith shouted, puffing out his chest. Barty Higgins grinned. $50 from Mr. Albright. A fine price for a strong back. Going once, going twice. Lillian closed her eyes, a prayer forming on her lips, a prayer for an end, any end to this nightmare. The sale was about to be finalized. Her son would be sent to a forge, his small hands calloused and burned. Her daughter, she couldn't bear to think of it. Then a new voice cut through the stagnant air. It was a voice as cool and deep as a desert well, a voice that carried an unmistakable authority. $150. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Heads swiveled, searching for the source of the impossible bid. The sum was not just a bid, it was the entire debt. It was a buyout, not a bargain. He stood at the back of the crowd, half shrouded in the shade of the livery stable. He was tall and lean, dressed in the simple functional garb of a working cowboy, dust-covered jeans, a worn leather vest over a dark cotton shirt, and scuffed boots. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but it couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw or the weathered topography of his features. He looked like a man who had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. This was Silas Blackwood. He was a relative newcomer to the area, a man who kept to himself. He owned a sizable tract of land up in the high country, a place most considered too remote and too wild to be profitable. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he conducted his business with a quiet, almost unnerving efficiency. He spoke little, observed much, and was the subject of endless, fearful speculation. Some said he was a former lawman. Others whispered he was an outlaw on the run. All anyone knew for sure was that there was a dangerous stillness about him, a sense of coiled power that discouraged idle questions. Barty Higgins's jaw hung slack. The crowd was utterly silent, their derision and amusement replaced by stunned disbelief. Even Cyrus looked as though he'd been slapped. 150. Barty stammered, his eyes wide. Did you say $150? Mr. Blackwood. Silas took a slow step forward, emerging from the shadows. The sunlight caught the silver buckle on his belt and the faint silvery tracery of a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to his temple. His eyes, a piercing shade of grey, were fixed not on the auctioneer, but on Lillian. For the first time, she felt a gaze that wasn't laced with lust or contempt. It was something else, something unreadable and intense, but it wasn't cruel. That's what I said. Silas confirmed, his voice low and steady. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt. In gold coin, the full amount. Barty was flustered. This was not how his auctions were supposed to go. They were meant to be drawn-out affairs full of competitive spite. This was a clean, swift execution. But money was money. Sold Barty practically shrieked, slamming a fat hand down on his ledger as if it were a gavel. To Mr. Silas Blackwood, for the full and final settlement of the debt, Silas moved through the parted crowd which gave way before him as if he were a phantom. He walked directly to the platform, and without a word to Barty, handed him the heavy pouch. Barty's greedy fingers fumbled to open it, his eyes gleaming at the sight of the gold. Cyrus Thompson, his face a mask of fury, stepped forward to intercept Silas. Blackwood, what is the meaning of this? This is family business. Silas finally turned his gaze on Cyrus. The stillness in his eyes hardened into something that made the other man take an involuntary step back. It stopped being family business when you put them on a block, Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. It's my business now. He turned his back on Cyrus, a dismissal so complete it was more insulting than any curse. He stepped up onto the platform. The wood creaked under his weight. He stopped in front of Lillian, his tall frame blocking out the sun, casting her and her children in his shadow. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 30s. His face was a road map of a hard life, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth. But those eyes, when they met hers, held an unexpected gentleness. He didn't speak to her. Instead, he knelt, bringing himself down to eye level with her children. The sudden movement made Caleb flinch and push Sarah further behind him. Silas ignored Caleb's defensive posture. He looked at the little girl, cowering behind her mother's skirt. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his deep voice softening to a low rumble. Sarah peeked out her thumb in her mouth. She stared at the formidable man before her, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and curiosity. "Her name is Sarah." Lillian answered for her, her own voice raspy with disuse. "And this is Caleb." Silas nodded his gaze, shifting to the boy. "Caleb. That's a strong name." He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face seemed to ease slightly. "No one's going to hurt you, or your sister, or your ma. You have my word." He said it with such simple, unwavering certainty that it cut through the fog of Lillian's fear. It was the first promise she had heard in a very long time that sounded like it might be true. Silas stood up, his attention returning to her. He surveyed the hostile crowd, then looked down the long, dusty road that led out of town. "Get your things," he said, his voice returning to its usual brusque tone. Lillian blinked, the unreality of the situation washing over her. "My things?" She whispered, a bitter laugh almost escaping her. "Mr. Blackwood, we have nothing. What you see is all that is left of us." Silas's gaze flickered to the bruise on her cheek, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. "Then there's nothing to weigh us down," he said. He extended a large, calloused hand toward her. It was not a gesture of command, but an invitation. "Come on, we're leaving this place." For a moment, Lillian hesitated. She was trading one form of bondage for another, a known evil for a complete and terrifying unknown. This man was a mystery, a figure of shadows and whispers. To go with him was a leap of faith into a darkness as profound as any she had ever known. But then she looked at the faces in the crowd, the leering blacksmith, the smug face of her brother-in-law, the cold, judgmental eyes of her former neighbors, and she looked at the small, trembling hands of her children clinging to her dress. That darkness was already here. It was in the sun-bleached dust of Redemption Gulch. She took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was laced with the grit of despair. She ignored the murmurs and glares from the townspeople. She ignored the sputtering rage of Cyrus Thompson. She looked into the steady grey eyes of Silas Blackwood, the man who had bought her, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself a fragile, dangerous seed of hope. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and steady, enveloping her smaller hand completely. It was not the hand of a master, but of a protector. "Thank you," she whispered the words, barely audible. Silas simply gave a curt nod. He led her and the twins from the platform of their humiliation, away from the jeering, silent crowd, and toward the dusty road that led out of a town that had long since forgotten the meaning of redemption. The town watched them go, their whispers following them like vultures, circling a fresh kill, completely unaware that the real story of Silas Blackwood and the widow Thompson had only just begun. And its ending would be something none of them could have ever predicted. The road out of Redemption Gulch was less a road and more a suggestion etched into the hard, cracked earth. It snaked away from the town, climbing steadily into the high, lonely country of rocky mesas and sparse, hardy pines. The whispers and stares of the townsfolk faded behind them, replaced by the vast, intimidating silence of the wilderness. Silas Blackwood had procured a sturdy mule from the livery, loading it with a few meager supplies he'd purchased with the last of his pocket money, a sack of flour, salted pork beans, and 2 new canteens of fresh water. He walked, leading the mule by its rope, his stride long and deceptively casual. Lillian and the twins walked behind him. The dust kicked up by his boots and the mule's hooves created a constant, gritty haze that they were forced to walk through. For the first hour, no one spoke. The silence was a heavy blanket, woven with fear, uncertainty, and the thrumming, unspoken questions that hung between them. Lillian's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had he done this? The auction had been a stage for public humiliation, a transaction of flesh and desperation. He had paid the full price, a sum that could have bought him a prize bull or a small plot of land. To spend it on a bruised widow and her 2 children made no sense. It was an act of either profound madness or of a purpose so deep she couldn't begin to fathom it. She studied his back. It was broad and straight, the muscles moving with an easy economy under his dark shirt. He moved like a predator, silent, aware, and utterly at home in this harsh landscape. There was nothing in his posture to suggest he was even thinking about them. He was simply moving forward, and they were following, drawn along in his wake like debris in a current. The sun was relentless. Sarah began to whimper, her small legs struggling to keep pace. Her face was flushed red, and her breath came in little sobs. Caleb, ever the stoic protector, took her hand, his own face a mask of determined grit. But Lillian could see the exhaustion in his eyes, too. "Mr. Blackwood," she finally said, her voice cracking from the dust and disuse. He stopped instantly, turning to face them. His grey eyes were unreadable as they took in the sight of the flushed, weary children. "They need to rest," Lillian said, a note of challenge in her tone. She was his property now in the eyes of the law and the town, but she would not see her children suffer in silence. "They can't keep this pace." Silas's gaze flickered from the children to her, then scanned the surrounding terrain. He pointed to a small cluster of gnarled junipers, offering a meager patch of shade a few hundred yards off the trail. "There," he said, his voice flat. "We'll rest there." He didn't wait for a reply, simply adjusted his path and led them toward the shade. When they reached it, he unstrapped one of the new canteens from the mule. He knelt just as he had on the platform in front of Sarah. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to her. She shrank back, hiding behind Lillian's skirt again. "It's all right, sweetheart," Lillian murmured, gently coaxing her forward. "He's not going to hurt you." She wasn't entirely sure if she believed her own words, but the children's needs overrode her own fear. Silas didn't press. He simply held the canteen out his hand, steady. After a long moment, Caleb stepped forward. "I'll take it," he said, his voice small but firm. He took the heavy canteen in both hands and carefully helped his sister drink. The sight of her gulping down the cool water, her small throat working, brought a sharp pang of relief to Lillian's chest. Caleb then drank himself before handing the canteen back to Silas with a solemn nod. Silas took it, his eyes lingering on the boy for a moment. Then he offered it to Lillian. She drank gratefully, the water washing away some of the dust and fear. He drank last a short, quick swallow before capping the canteen and strapping it back on the mule. He sat down with his back against one of the twisted tree trunks, pulling his hat low over his eyes. He looked for all the world like he was asleep. But Lillian knew he wasn't. The stillness about him was watchful alert. She settled the children in the shade, whispering to them, trying to soothe their fears. They were exhausted and quickly drifted off into a fitful sleep, their small bodies curled together on the hard ground. For the first time, Lillian had a moment to truly confront the terrifying reality of her situation. She was alone in the wilderness with a man who was a complete stranger, a man who had bought her. The word itself was a brand on her soul. What would he expect of her when they reached his home? The blacksmith's leering face flashed in her mind. Would Silas, despite his initial detachment, demand the same kind of service? Her blood ran cold at the thought. She had to know. She couldn't walk for another 5 hours or 5 days with this terror eating away at her. Steeling herself, she stood up and walked to where he sat. Mr. Blackwood, one eye opened under the brim of his hat, a sliver of grey ice. "I have to ask," she began. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. When we get to your home, what is it you expect of me?" He didn't move. His gaze was steady, patient, as if he had been waiting for this question. "I expect you to keep your children safe. I expect you to eat the food I provide and sleep under the roof I offer. I expect you to get your strength back." His answer was so far from what she had feared that it left her speechless. It was practical, devoid of any sinister implication, yet it answered nothing at all. But I am indentured, she stammered. The law says I must work for you for 2 years. To pay the debt. He finally pushed his hat back, revealing his full face. The scar near his eye seemed to pale in the harsh light. The debt is paid, Mrs. Thompson. I paid it. In full. You are not indentured to me, the law is satisfied. This was even more confusing. Then why? The word escaped her in a desperate whisper. Why would you do that? No one would do that. For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been emotion crossed his face. It was a deep, ancient sadness. Let's just say I was repaying a debt of my own, he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. It has nothing to do with you. He stood up, his tall frame once again, blocking out the sun. We should keep moving. It will be dark in a few hours. He was shutting her down, raising a wall as solid and impenetrable as the mesas around them. But in his words, she had found a small, crucial piece of information. It has nothing to do with you. This wasn't about her. It wasn't about her body or her labor in the way she had feared. This man's motives were his own, a secret he held close to his chest. And for some reason, that knowledge was more comforting than frightening. An unknown purpose was better than a known evil. The rest of the journey passed in a similar vein. Silas remained distant, but his actions spoke a different language. When they had to cross a shallow, fast-moving creek, he carried Sarah across on his shoulders without a word, then came back for Caleb. When the trail grew steep and Lillian faltered, his hand was suddenly there, steadying her elbow, withdrawing the second she regained her footing. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of purple and orange, they crested a final rise. Below them, nestled in a small, verdant valley, was a single cabin. A thread of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcome beacon in the encroaching twilight. The homestead was surrounded by a sturdy fence, and a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in a nearby pasture. It was isolated a world away from the noise and cruelty of Redemption Gulch, but it was not a place of menace. It looked peaceful. "We're here," Silas said. As they approached, the cabin door opened, and a figure was silhouetted in the warm lamplight from within. It was a man old and wiry, with a shock of white hair and a weathered face. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm, but he lowered it when he saw Silas. "Took you long enough," the old man grumbled, though his eyes were full of relief. His gaze then fell on Lillian and the twins, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Silas. What in blazes is this?" Silas stopped before the man, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's a long story, George. A long story." He turned to Lillian, his expression unreadable as ever. "Mrs. Thompson, this is George Hackett. He helps me run this place." He then looked at her, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Welcome to my home. You're safe here." Lillian looked from the formidable, silent cowboy to the grizzled but seemingly harmless old man, to the sturdy cabin with its welcoming light. She looked at her children, who were staring at the cabin with wide, curious eyes, their fear momentarily forgotten. Safety. It was a concept she had forgotten the meaning of. She didn't know if she could believe him, not yet. But as she stepped across the threshold, out of the growing darkness and into the warm, quiet light of the cabin, she felt the first tentative loosening of the knot of terror that had been clenched in her stomach for months. It wasn't freedom, not yet. But it wasn't a cage either. It was something else entirely, a new chapter in a story she was only just beginning to understand. The interior of the cabin was a reflection of the man who built it, Spartan functional and immaculately clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of what smelled like stew bubbling merrily over a low flame. A rough-hewn wooden table with 2 benches stood in the center of the main room. To the right was a small partitioned-off area for cooking with shelves holding tin plates and neatly stacked supplies. To the left were 2 closed doors. The entire space was lit by the warm, steady glow of several oil lamps. It was a home built for solitude, not for a family. George Hackett. The old man stared openly, his mouth slightly agape as Lillian and the twins stepped inside. His eyes, sharp and bird-like, darted from the bruise on Lillian's cheek to the children's tattered clothes, and finally to Silas's grim face. He was a man accustomed to Silas's long silences and sudden departures, but this was a development he clearly hadn't anticipated. "Silas, you'd best start talking," George said, finally breaking the silence. "And it better be good." Silas unburdened the mule and set the new supplies on the table. He looked at Lillian. "The children are hungry and tired. The story can wait." His tone left no room for argument. He turned to George. "Is the West Room ready?" George nodded, his bewilderment slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance of his friend's mysterious ways. "Aye, clean linens, just like you asked before you left." This small detail sent a jolt through Lillian. He had prepared for her. He had told George to make a room ready before he even went to town. This wasn't an impulse. It was a plan. The mystery of his motives deepened, but the fear receded another crucial inch. "That room is for you, and the children," Silas said, gesturing to one of the closed doors. "George and I will take the other." Lillian was stunned. In her world, a woman in her position would be lucky to get a pallet by the hearth. To be given a private room, a door that could be closed, was a luxury she couldn't have dreamed of. It was a gesture of respect, a clear and deliberate boundary that flew in the face of her status as a bought woman. I can't take your room, Mr. Blackwood," she stammered. "We can sleep by the fire." "We don't mind." "It's not my room," he stated simply. "It's the guest room, and you are my guests." He then turned and walked through the second door, closing it firmly behind him, the conversation clearly over. George let out a long, low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, shaking his head. He gave Lillian a wry, not unkind look. "Don't mind him, ma'am. He ain't much for palaver. Name's George." He offered a calloused hand. "Looks like you've had a rough go of it. Come on, let's get some of that stew into those little ones." George's gruff kindness was the final key that unlocked Lillian's composure. The tension, fear, and humiliation of the day, combined with this unexpected decency, overwhelmed her. Her eyes filled with tears, and to her own mortification, a sob escaped her. The children, seeing their mother cry, immediately started to weep as well. The quiet cabin was suddenly filled with the sound of their collective grief. George looked panicked for a second, but then his weathered face softened. "Here now, none of that," he said gently. He ladled stew into 3 bowls with a surprising deftness. "Nothing looks so bad on a full stomach. You just sit. Sit and eat." Lillian, struggling for control, managed a watery smile and guided Caleb and Sarah to the bench. They ate ravenously, the simple, hearty stew warming them from the inside out. Lillian ate too, each spoonful a small act of defiance against the starvation and despair of the past few months. After they had eaten, she led the children to the room Silas had indicated. It was small, but like the rest of the cabin, it was clean and well kept. A large, comfortable-looking bed with a handmade quilt dominated the space. A small wooden chest stood at its foot. There was even a window covered by a simple cloth curtain that looked out over the moonlit valley. The children, exhausted from their ordeal, were asleep almost as soon as their heads hit the pillow. Lillian sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of George's voice from the main room, the profound and absolute silence from behind Silas's door. The next few days fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Lillian, driven by a desperate need to prove her worth and establish her place, rose before the sun. She took over the cooking, insisted on mending the men's clothes, and kept the cabin even more spotless than it already was. She expected orders, commands, a list of chores. But none came. Silas and George would rise in the dark, eat the breakfast she prepared in near total silence, and then head out to work the ranch. She would watch them from the window, two figures moving with a shared, tireless purpose against the vast backdrop of the mountains. They mended fences, tended to the small herd of cattle, and cleared new pasture land. Silas moved with a relentless energy, as if he were trying to physically exhaust a demon that lived inside him. He barely spoke to her. His interactions were limited to brief, courteous acknowledgments. "Morning, Ma'am. The coffee is good. Thank you for the meal." He never called her Lillian, and she continued to call him Mr. Blackwood. The distance between them was a chasm, yet it was a strangely peaceful one. She was living in the home of a man who owned her freedom, yet she felt more liberated than she had in years. She wasn't Cyrus's tormented sister-in-law or the town's pitiful charity case. Here in this strange man's house, she was simply a presence. Her children began to heal. The haunted look in their eyes started to recede, replaced by a childlike curiosity. Caleb, emboldened by the lack of threat, began to tentatively explore the area around the cabin. George, who initially seemed wary of the children, quickly succumbed to their innocence. He started leaving them small carvings by the door, a bird, a horse, a tiny, perfect canoe. He taught Caleb how to whittle a stick into a sharp point, and showed Sarah how to identify the wildflowers that grew in the valley. Silas's interactions with the children remained rare, but they were significant. One afternoon, Lillian saw him from the window standing perfectly still by the pasture fence. Caleb had gotten too close to a new mother cow who was aggressively protective of her calf. The cow lowered its head, pawing the ground. Before Lillian could even cry out, Silas was moving. He didn't shout. He simply placed himself between the boy and the agitated animal, his presence so calm and authoritative that the cow immediately backed down, nudging her calf away. He then turned to Caleb, knelt and spoke to him quietly for a few moments, pointing out the signs of an angry cow. He wasn't scolding, he was teaching. He was protecting. Another evening, as Lillian was tucking Sarah into bed, the little girl was holding up a book. It was a beautiful, leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. "Where did you get this, sweetheart?" Lillian asked, her heart skipping a beat. "The quiet man gave it to me," Sarah whispered. "He said the words are like music." Lillian looked inside the cover. In elegant cursive script was a name, Silas Blackwood. This rough, silent cowboy, this man of the unforgiving wilderness, read Shakespeare. The discovery was like finding a rose blooming on a granite cliff. The pieces of the puzzle of Silas Blackwood were beginning to form, but they created a picture that made no sense. He was a rancher, but he fought with the skill of a trained soldier. He was a man of the West, but he was educated and well-read. He was a recluse who sought solitude, yet he had deliberately brought a widow and 2 children into his home. He was a man of profound gentleness with her children. Yet there was a hardness in him, a capacity for violence that she could sense coiled just beneath the surface. He was a walking contradiction. Her fear of him had all but vanished, replaced by an intense, consuming curiosity. The question was no longer what he would do to her, but who he was. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the answer to that question was tied inextricably to the husband she had lost and the life that had been stolen from her. The peace they had found in this valley was fragile an eye of the storm, and she had a dreadful feeling that the storm was coming for them. The storm arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Lillian was hanging laundry when the rhythmic beat of shod hooves echoed down the trail. 3 riders descended into the valley. Even from a distance, she recognized the arrogant posture of the man in the lead, Cyrus Thompson. Her blood ran cold. Caleb Sarah. Inside, now she screamed. She hustled the terrified children into their room, her heart hammering. "Lock the door, and do not come out until I say so." The bolt slid home with a heavy thunk. Grabbing the iron poker from the fireplace, she stood in the center of the room and waited. Lillian Cyrus's oily voice called out, "I know you're in there. That rancher Blackwood isn't here to protect you now. I've come to take you home." The door banged open. Cyrus stood there flanked by 2 hired brutes from town, a predatory grin on his face. "There you are. Did you really think you could hide from me?" "I own you, Lillian. That fool Blackwood paid the town, but you still owe me." "I owe you nothing," she spat. "You're a thief who stole my husband's farm." Cyrus laughed, an ugly, sharp sound. "The land is nothing. It's what Daniel found that I want." The map. The map to the Culebra mine. He wrote to me about it, the fool, right before his accident. I know he gave it to you. "Where is it?" He lunged. Lillian swung the poker with all her might, catching him on the shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, but his thugs moved in easily, wrenching the poker from her grasp and twisting her arm behind her back. "Foolish woman," Cyrus hissed, advancing on her. "We'll find that map, and then we'll settle the debt you owe me." A voice calm and deadly as a rattlesnake's warning cut through the air. "I believe you were leaving." Everyone froze. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway, a figure of pure menace. Behind him, George held a rifle steady. Cyrus's face went pale. "Blackwood, this is a family discussion. Your discussion is over," Silas said, taking a deliberate step into the cabin. "Let her go." The thug holding Lillian hesitated. In a blur of inhuman speed, Silas crossed the room. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the man holding Lillian collapsed unconscious. The second thug fumbled for his pistol, but only let out a strangled grunt as Silas drove an elbow into his throat, sending him crumpling to the floor. In less than 5 seconds, Cyrus was left alone, trembling before a man who had dismantled his muscle with terrifying efficiency. Silas turned his cold, dead-eyed gaze on him. "You came for a map," he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what you're talking about," Cyrus stammered. "Daniel Thompson was my friend." "Silas," said his voice a low, dangerous growl. The words hit Lillian with the force of a physical blow. "Daniel's friend. We served together." Silas continued advancing on the terrified Cyrus. "We made a pact. If anything happened to one of us, the other would look out for his family. Daniel wrote to me. He said you were getting greedy. He suspected you might try something." Silas stood directly in front of Cyrus, now his presence suffocating. "Daniel didn't have an accident, did he? You were there when his wagon went over the ravine. You cut the brake line." "No, it's a lie," Cyrus shrieked. "I found where you sawed through it." Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I came to this territory to bring you to justice. But when I arrived, I found his wife and children on an auction block. You didn't just kill him. You tried to erase everything he ever loved." The puzzle pieces of Silas Blackwood slammed into place in Lillian's mind, forming a picture of love, honor, and a terrible, hidden promise. This man hadn't bought her. He had rescued her. He was fulfilling a sacred vow. Now Silas said, his hand shooting out to grab the front of Cyrus's shirt. "You're going to tell me exactly what happened, and then George is going to ride for a real lawman, and you're going to hang." The storm had broken. As Cyrus began to babble his confession, Lillian looked at the man she had feared and failed to understand. She saw him not as a cowboy or an outlaw, but as a guardian, a promise keeper, the justice her husband and her family deserved. The confession poured out of Cyrus Thompson in a desperate, whimpering torrent. He admitted to sabotaging the wagon, forging the land documents, and his obsessive hunt for the map, a litany of greed and evil that left no room for doubt. When his pleas for mercy finally subsided, Silas shoved him toward George. "Tie him up," Silas commanded, his voice cold as iron. "Ride for Fort Bridger. Their law is honest. Ask for Marshal Clayton and tell him Silas Blackwood sent you. Tell him I have a murderer for him." George nodded grimly, hauling the blubbering Cyrus outside to deal with him and the two groaning thugs. Silence descended heavy with violence and unveiled truths. Lillian stood by the hearth, trembling. She looked at Silas, seeing past the avenger, to the profound weariness in his eyes, the grief of a man whose burden was finally laid down. He met her gaze, his own filled with regret. "Lillian," he said, the use of her first name both startling and intimate. "I'm sorry. I should have told you everything from the start." "You saved us," she whispered. "You honored him." "Daniel was my brother Silas," said his voice rough with emotion. "Not by blood, but by something the war forged between us. We swore an oath to be each other's keepers. The last letter I got from him, he was worried about Cyrus. He said he was getting greedy. I should have come sooner." The guilt in his voice was a raw, open wound. "You came when we needed you most," Lillian insisted softly. "You cannot carry the blame for what a wicked man did." She paused, the pieces clicking into place. Cyrus was looking for a map. Daniel must have hidden it. "Did he give you anything before he died? Anything for safekeeping?" Lillian's mind flew back through the fog of grief to the week before Daniel's death. He had been carving toys for the children, strangely intent on his work. It wasn't the doll for Sarah, she remembered, but the gift he gave Caleb. "Caleb soldier," she breathed. She rushed to the children's room where Caleb stood guard. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "may I see your toy soldier? It's very important." The boy, sensing the gravity of the moment, handed over his most prized possession. Lillian carried the worn, painted soldier back to the main room. Silas watched his expression intent. Her fingers traced the crude carving, feeling for an imperfection. At the base, she found an almost invisible seam. She twisted. The base popped off, revealing a hollow cavity. Tucked inside was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of oilskin. With trembling hands, she unrolled it. It was a map drawn in Daniel's familiar hand, showing the creeks and mesas of the high country. Marked with a simple X was the location of the Culebra mine. He put his family's future in his son's hands, Silas said in a reverent whisper. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching riders, the heavy, steady tread of a large group. Silas moved to the door as a posse led by a stern-faced marshal dismounted. George was with them, pointing toward the cabin. "Marshal Clayton," Silas said in relief. "The law is here." But from the barn, Cyrus made his last desperate play. "It's a lie," he shrieked. "Blackwood's an outlaw. He killed my brother for that map. He's holding that woman and her children hostage." Doubt flickered across the faces of the men from Redemption Gulch who were part of the posse. They knew Cyrus as a landowner and Silas as a dangerous stranger. Cyrus's lie was a seed planted in fertile ground. "What is this Blackwood?" The marshal demanded, his hand resting on his pistol. Before Silas could answer, Lillian stepped past him out into the sunlight. She stood tall, her head held high, the map clutched in her hand. "My name is Lillian Thompson," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "My husband Daniel was murdered by his own brother Cyrus." She turned her burning gaze upon the men from her former town. "I stood on a block in your town and you watched. You bid on my children's lives while a murderer stood among you. Not one of you spoke up." Shame rippled through the men. They shuffled their feet, unable to meet her eyes. "This man," she declared, pointing to Silas, "is no outlaw. He was my husband's dearest friend. He kept a promise that you all forgot the meaning of. He saved my children and uncovered the truth while you did nothing." She held up the map for all to see. "This is what Cyrus killed his brother for. This is the truth. And every one of you from Redemption Gulch is a witness to the evil you were willing to ignore." The town was in tears, but they were not tears of pity. They were the bitter tears of shame. The town's dark secret had been laid bare not by a lawman, but by the quiet honor of a stranger and the fierce, newly awakened strength of the woman they had cast aside. Lillian's words, delivered with the force of a final, damning verdict, hung in the crisp autumn air. Marshal Clayton, an astute man who had seen his share of frontier justice and injustice, looked from Lillian's defiant face to the crumbling disgrace of the men from Redemption Gulch, and then to the confession-spattered, terrified face of Cyrus as he was hauled from the barn. The truth was as clear and bright as the morning sun. The law took its course with a swiftness that was in itself a form of mercy. Cyrus and his thugs were taken to Fort Bridger for trial. With the map as evidence, George's testimony, and Lillian's unwavering account, Cyrus Thompson was convicted of murder and fraud. He was hanged 2 months later, his name becoming a permanent stain on the history of the town that had for a time revered him. The town of Redemption Gulch was forced into a painful reckoning with itself. The shame of what they had allowed to happen, of how close they had come to being complicit in the destruction of an innocent family, settled over them like a shroud. The paupers' auction was abolished, a silent admission of their collective guilt. They had been left in tears, not of sorrow for the wicked man they had lost, but of shame for the goodness they had so nearly destroyed. Back in the quiet valley, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. With Cyrus gone, and the truth revealed a strange new stillness settled over the homestead. The purpose that had driven Silas, the promise that had guided his every action, was fulfilled. One evening, as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, he sat with Lillian at the rough-hewn table. The children were asleep safe and warm in their beds. The map lay on the table between them. "It's yours," Silas said, his voice quiet. "It was Daniel's legacy to you. The mine will make you a wealthy woman. You and the children will be able to go anywhere, start a new life away from all this." Lillian looked at the map, then at the man across from her. She thought of the life it promised, a life of ease in a bustling city like Denver or San Francisco, a life free from hardship. But then she looked around the small, sturdy cabin at the warm glow of the firelight on the wooden walls. She thought of George's gruff kindness, of her children's laughter, echoing in the valley, of the quiet, powerful presence of the man who had shown her the meaning of honor. "What will you do?" she asked him. A shadow passed over his face. "I'll move on. I was never the settling kind. You have a home here," she said softly. "You built it." "It's just a place," he countered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. "No, it's not," Lillian insisted, her voice gaining strength. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. His skin was calloused and rough, but his hand was steady beneath hers. "My whole life, I was told what my place was. First as a daughter, then a wife, then a widow. In Redemption Gulch, my place was on a block to be sold. But here, in this valley with you, I haven't felt like I was in a place. I've felt like I was home." She looked him directly in the eye, her heart in her gaze. "We're not a debt to be repaid, Silas. We're a family. You, me, Caleb, and Sarah. If you want us. The gold in that mountain means nothing to me if we don't have this. Don't you see, you are our safe harbor. You are our home." Silas stared at her, his composure finally cracking. For the first time, she saw the walls he had built around his heart crumble. The solitary rancher, the haunted veteran, the promise keeper. All of those men gave way to the man beneath a man who was just as lost and scarred as she was. He slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "I'm not a good man, Lillian," he whispered, his voice thick with a lifetime of pain. "You are the best man I have ever known," she replied, her own tears falling freely now, but they were tears of joy. They didn't find a fairy tale ending. Their life was hard, dictated by the unforgiving seasons of the high country. But they found something far more real. They found redemption, not in a town's name, but in the quiet daily acts of building a life together. They worked the land, raised the children, and slowly, gently healed each other's scars. The Culebra mine provided them with comfort and security, but their true treasure was found in the laughter of their children, the warmth of their hearth, and the silent, unbreakable bond between a cowboy who had bought a beaten widow and the family that had in the end truly brought him home. YouTube conclusion. That was the story of Silas Blackwood and Lillian Thompson. A tale born from the dust and cruelty of a forgotten frontier town. It reminds us that the deepest wounds are often hidden, and that true character isn't revealed in times of ease, but in the face of injustice. Their story wasn't just about a cowboy and a widow. It was about the promises we keep, the debts we choose to pay, and the extraordinary power of a single act of courage to shatter a world of lies. It proves that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in a mine, but are found in the fierce, unyielding love of a family, forged in the fires of adversity. If this story of honor and redemption moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story with a real heart. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more tales from the wild pages of history. Thank you for listening.